The knock came at 11:04 p.m., which I know because I was staring at the microwave clock deciding whether reheated pasta was a dinner or a surrender, and the sound was so quiet I almost let it go. It was the kind of knock that apologizes for itself. 3 small taps, the way a person knocks when they're not sure they deserve to be heard. I set down the fork. Stood there for a second. The pasta could wait. When I opened the door, I expected a neighbor, a wrong address, a delivery gone sideways. I did not expect Nora Callum. Nora Callum, who was 52 years old and the mother of the woman who had handed me back my apartment key 18 months ago without making eye contact. Nora, who I had met exactly 7 times over 3 years, who made excellent lemon cake and asked too many questions about my job and once caught me crying at her kitchen table after a 6-hour drive and didn't say a word, just put a cup of tea down next to my elbow and left the room. She was standing in the hallway outside my apartment in a raincoat that was soaked through, holding a small overnight bag like she wasn't sure if she'd be allowed to keep it. Her hair was wet. Her eyes were dry. She said very quietly, "I didn't know where else to go." I should have had a reasonable response to that. I didn't. My name is Cal Devere. I'm 34. I work as a building surveyor for a mid-sized firm in the city, which means I spend most of my professional life standing in rooms that look fine and finding the evidence of everything that isn't. Subsidence. Rising damp. Structural fatigue hiding behind fresh paint. People hire me to tell them the truth about a building before they commit to it, and I've gotten good at reading surfaces for what's underneath. The job is unglamorous in the exact way that useful jobs always are. I drive a van. I wear steel-toed boots. I carry a moisture meter and a torch and a clipboard, and I write reports that either save people money or ruin their afternoon. My life outside work is quieter than most people assume it should be at 34. I live alone in a first-floor flat in a neighborhood that's been up and coming for so long it's basically permanent middle age. Good coffee, decent Thai place, parking that requires patience and a specific kind of optimism. I own a second-hand sofa that's better than it looks and a collection of paperbacks that I keep meaning to organize and never do. I cook on weekdays because it's cheaper than ordering in, and I reheat on weekends because I cook too much on weekdays. The reason I live alone is not a mystery. Her name was Rose, and we were together for 5 years, and the relationship ended the way long relationships sometimes end. Not in a fight, not in a revelation, but in a long quiet drift apart that we both saw coming and neither of us said anything about until it was too late to be kind. Rose took the cat. I kept the flat. We were both fine with this. Not bitter, just recalibrated. I'd had 18 months to understand that the person I missed wasn't quite Rose herself but the version of myself that had someone to come home to. That's a different kind of grief. Smaller and stranger. Easier to live with once you name it. I'd dated a little since then. Nothing that grew into anything. Not by accident, I just hadn't been particularly interested in constructing a new life around someone new. There was something almost comfortable about the flat when it was exactly what I'd made it. About evenings that went the way I expected them to go. That comfort was, as of 11:04 p.m. on a wet Tuesday in March, officially over. Before I go any further, if you're listening to this right now, drop a comment and tell me where in the world you're watching from. These stories have been traveling further than I ever expected, and I genuinely want to know where they're landing. All right. Back to it. Back to it, which means back to the doorway, where I was standing in socked feet trying to do quick quiet math about what a person is supposed to do when their ex's mother appears dripping in their hallway at 11 o'clock on a Tuesday. The building was old. Edwardian, my surveyor's brain noted automatically. The cornicing in the hall was original, badly painted over maybe 6 times. The radiator at the end of the corridor was cast iron and original and also entirely decorative because it had stopped working in 2019. The hallway smelled of the downstairs neighbors cooking and someone's wet umbrella and the particular dampness that old buildings carry the way people carry old sadness. Not acutely, just always present underneath. The single overhead bulb in my entry gave everything a slightly amber quality, which is either atmospheric or depressing depending on your circumstances. I stepped back. She came in. She didn't sweep in. She didn't drift. She moved the way someone moves who has learned to take up exactly the amount of space that is offered to them and not 1 inch more, careful, deliberate, like she was measuring each step against the possibility of being too much. She stood in my narrow hallway and looked at the walls briefly, cataloging, the way people do when they're trying to orient themselves somewhere unfamiliar. Then she looked at me. Her eyes were brown-gray, the color of concrete in morning light. She had one of those faces that was composed in a way that looked like calm but wasn't. It was the face of someone who had practiced composure for a very long time and could maintain it even when things were bad. I'd noticed that the first time I'd met her at some barbecue at Rosa's place 3 years ago. I'd thought at the time, she has seen some things and she is not going to tell you about them. She was still wearing the wet raincoat. She hadn't taken it off, which I registered as, she wasn't sure she was staying. "Nora," I said. "Let me take that." She hesitated, a single beat, almost imperceptible, then let me help her out of the coat. Underneath she was in the kind of clothes that suggested she'd packed quickly. A dark jumper, jeans, boots that were damp at the hem. A small tear at the inner seam of one sleeve that she'd pinned closed with a safety pin, which she noticed me noticing and moved her arms slightly so the pin was hidden behind her. That was the first specific detail that made her real to me in a new way. Not the arrival. Not the wet coat. The safety pin. The tiny private repair she'd made that she didn't want seen. She had a habit of doing something with her left hand when she was thinking. Pressing her thumb against the tip of each finger in turn, very slowly, like she was counting something. I'd seen it once at a Christmas dinner at Rosa's and I saw it now. She did it while I hung her coat on the hook by the door, and when I turned around she'd stopped. "I'm sorry," she said. "I know this is..." She stopped. Started again. "I didn't plan this." "I know," I said. "Rose doesn't know I'm here." "Okay. I mean she definitely does not know. And I'd prefer..." "Nora." I said her name in the way that means I understand, keep going. She exhaled. Looked at me. Said, "Could I stay the night?" "Just tonight. I'll sort something else out in the morning." I said, "Let me put the kettle on." She blinked once, slowly, like she was recalibrating. That was the story's real beginning. Not the knock. Not the, I didn't know where else to go. The moment when I asked no questions and put the kettle on, and she stood in my hallway with her safety pin sleeve and didn't cry. The following Saturday, I made the mistake of going to Joel Hartley's birthday drinks. Joel was a friend from university, good man, terrible social judgment. His birthday parties had a way of assembling everyone who had ever known Joel in a specific 3-year window, which meant they were crowded with people I hadn't seen in years and had various unfinished emotional business with. I'd almost canceled. I should have canceled. But Nora had spent the week on my sofa being quietly and determinedly no trouble at all, making tea I didn't ask for, sleeping at reasonable hours, finding a temp agency online and sending applications from my kitchen table with a kind of focused efficiency that somehow made me feel both useful and useless. And I thought, go out. Give her the flat for the evening. Stop orbiting her like she's a problem you're trying to solve. So I went. The pub was loud and warm and full of Joel's extended social web. I had 2 beers and a conversation about property prices that I initiated defensively to stop someone asking about my personal life. And then of course Rose walked in. She looked fine. Better than fine, she looked exactly like herself, which was a different kind of difficult. She was with a group of her own friends, there for the same party from a different branch of Joel's life, and she crossed the room toward me with the particular ease of someone who has thoroughly processed a breakup and genuinely holds no hard feelings. We were civil. Actually, it went fine. We caught up briefly. She changed jobs. I'd repainted the kitchen. The usual. And then she said, with that very specific careful tone that I recognized as prescripted, "My mum's staying with you." "Just for a bit," I said. Rose looked at me in a way that was not quite hurt and not quite grateful and was probably some third thing I didn't have a name for. She said, "She called you. She knocked on my door." Same thing. "It's really not." We looked at each other. A beat. Then she said quietly, "Is she okay?" "She's better than she was on Tuesday," I said. "I think." Rose nodded, and I could see her deciding to say something and then not saying it, which was a habit she'd always had, and one I'd always found maddening, and I felt a small involuntary spike of something, not emotion exactly, more the memory of emotion, the body's echo of a thing it used to do. That's when Craig Elliott appeared. Craig was Joel's oldest friend from school, which is to say Joel had known him too long to stop inviting him to things and now couldn't remember why he'd wanted to. He was the kind of man who takes up more conversational space than he deserves and does it confidently enough that the room often doesn't notice. He'd had 3 drinks or 4. He was in good humor. He clapped me on the shoulder, harder than necessary, and said to Rose, "Heard your mum's dosing up at Cal's place. What is that, you two getting back together via proxy?" He laughed at his own joke. Cougar situation, is it? Your ex and your mum. He said it like it was clever. Like it was the kind of thing you say. The room around us didn't quite go silent, too loud for that, but the 4 or 5 people in our immediate circle did that thing where they suddenly become very interested in their drinks. Rose looked mortified. Craig was still grinning. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't do the thing where you lean in and get very quiet. I just looked at him and said, clearly and without any particular heat, Nora's been through something this week that she hasn't told most people yet. She needed somewhere to stay where no one would ask too many questions. I have a sofa and I don't ask too many questions. That's the full story, Craig. Pause. So maybe leave it there, I said. Craig made a sound that was almost a laugh and looked around for allies and didn't quite find them. Joel, who had heard the whole thing, studied the bottom of his pint. The woman to my left, someone I didn't know, nodded almost imperceptibly. Rose looked at me with an expression I couldn't fully decode. Something between relief and something older than relief. Craig drifted away. People resumed their conversations. Something shifted in my sternum, not dramatically. Just a small recalibration, like a wall I'd built a long time ago had moved very slightly to allow a different angle of light. I finished my drink. Went home. Nora had left the lamp on. She was still awake when I got back, which surprised me. The flat was quiet, the good kind, not the empty kind, and she was sitting at my kitchen table with a mug of tea and a piece of paper covered in numbers. Budget calculations. She had a pen in her hand and was tapping it against the table slowly, rhythmically, the kind of unconscious rhythm that means a person is thinking very hard and would prefer not to be interrupted. I interrupted her anyway. Partly because it was my flat. Tea's in the pot, she said without looking up. I found the pot. Found a mug. The tea was still warm, which meant she'd made it recently enough to count as a peace offering. I sat down across from her at the table. She had covered one corner of the calculations with small, precise annotations. Not the panicked kind of arithmetic that people do when they're scared, but methodical, steady, like she was building a small and solid thing out of uncertain materials. I didn't look directly at the numbers. That seemed like a border. How was it? She asked. Fine. Joel's good. Joel is always fine. That's his main quality. She made a sound that was almost a laugh. Almost. Rose was there, I said. The pen went still on the table. She knows you're here, I said. She doesn't. I thought about how to say the next part. She's not angry. I think she's relieved someone knows. Nora looked at her numbers for a moment. Then she said quietly, she worries about me the way I used to worry about my mother. It's uncomfortable for both of us. Knowing people care about you usually is, I said. She looked up at me then. The lamp over the table was warm and slightly inadequate the way cheap lamps are, and in that light her face was tired in a specific way, not sleepy but the tiredness of a person who has been performing steadiness for many days in a row. The composure was still there. But the seams were more visible than they had been on Tuesday. You told Rose something happened, she said. It wasn't a question. I said you'd been through something that you hadn't told most people yet. She was quiet for a moment. That's true. I know. You didn't ask. No. You've been letting me stay in your flat for 5 days without asking what happened. She said it like she was reading something she was still making sense of. Why? I moved my mug slightly to the left for no reason. Because you'd tell me if you needed to. She looked at me for a long second. Then she went back to her calculations. But the pen didn't tap anymore. She told me on Thursday in pieces. Not at the table, she told me standing at the kitchen counter while I made breakfast, which meant neither of us had to look directly at each other, which I think was the point. The short version, her husband, Rosa's father, Ray Callum, from whom Nora had been separated for going on 3 years, had decided to sell the house. Their house. The house Nora had lived in for 26 years. He'd sent her a formal legal notice and she'd received it the day she knocked on my door. Her own solicitor couldn't see her until the following week. Her sister lived abroad. Her 2 closest friends were both, by some cruel scheduling coincidence, away for the week. I didn't have a crisis plan, she said. Which is embarrassing actually. I should have had a crisis plan. Most people don't, I said. I kept thinking, I just need somewhere to sit for a day. Somewhere no one will try to help me too much. And then I thought of your flat. I handed her a plate of toast. I'm going to take that as a compliment. It was meant as one, she said, and there was a dry edge to it that I hadn't heard from her before, something that had been in there all along, under the careful composure, and was now beginning to surface. She took the toast without looking at me and stood at the counter eating it, and I thought, she is going to be fine. That's not the same as her being fine right now. But she is going to be fine. That was the first time I thought anything like that about her. The solicitor appointment was on Friday morning. I offered to drive her. She said it wasn't necessary. I said the public transport to the area was genuinely terrible. I'd done surveys in that part of the city and I knew firsthand, which was true and also a convenient cover for the fact that I simply wanted to be there. She agreed in the way someone agrees to something they've already decided they want but feel they should resist. We drove across the city in morning traffic. She looked out the window at the buildings. I drove. We didn't talk much, which was comfortable in the way that silences are comfortable when neither person is filling them out of anxiety. At a light, she said, "You have a surveyor's sticker in your back window. It came with the van. It says no access without prior consent. Professionally relevant. It sounds like a warning. Does it?" She looked at me with the corner of her mouth doing something quiet that wasn't quite a smile. "Not for you, I assume. You seem to operate on a kind of assumed access." I said, "I knocked." "The kettle counts," she said. The light changed. I pulled forward. The conversation finished before it became something more, which was the rhythm we seemed to have, things that almost reached a point and then folded back surface smooth into something lighter. But in the moment after, the small silence that followed, I was aware of her in the passenger seat in a way that felt distinct from the week before. Not new exactly. More like a channel that had been there all along, getting incrementally wider. I moved us into the left lane. Said nothing about it. She came back from the solicitor looking like she'd run 10 miles in the wrong direction. I was parked down the street and I watched her come out of the building and stand on the pavement for a moment. Just stood there in the weak Friday morning sun, and took a long breath and squared her shoulders. I thought, she does that every time. The breath and the square of the shoulders. She does it whenever something is difficult and she's about to push on anyway. I'd seen it half a dozen times in the last week without registering it as a pattern until just then. She got in the van. "Good news," she said. "Bad news." "Good news first. I have more options than I thought. The property's in both our names. He can't sell without my signature, which he apparently forgot or ignored, and my solicitor is fairly confident that gives us reasonable leverage. That's not bad news, that's good news. The bad news is that it's going to take a while and cost a fair amount and I need to make some decisions I'm not entirely ready to make." I drove. Let her sit with it. "The other bad news," she said after a moment, "is that I've been in your flat for a week and I've been putting off the question of what comes next, and I think I've run out of days to put it off." "There's a serviced apartment on Fenwick Road," I said. "I did the structural survey last year, building's sound, management's decent. I could call ahead if that helps." She was quiet. "Or," I said, "the sofa's available for a bit longer. If you need the time." She looked at me. Something in her face shifted, not the composure itself but the effort behind it, the scaffolding. Just briefly. "Cal," she said. Why are you being this kind?" I thought about it. "Habit," I said. She made a small sound. "That's not an answer." "No," I agreed. I didn't give her a better one. We drove the rest of the way in silence. But when I parked outside the flat and turned off the engine, she didn't get out immediately. She sat for a moment, her left hand doing the thing with the fingers, thumb to index, index to middle, middle to ring, and then she stopped and she said, "I'd like to stay if that's still on offer." "It's on offer," I said. "Hold on a second, I need to know something. Where in the world are you listening to this right now? Drop it in the comments. People have been leaving locations from places I've never even thought about, and it means more than I can explain. Subscribe if you haven't yet, there's another story coming next week and you won't want to miss it." "Okay, I'm back." She stayed. The days developed their own structure, the way days do when two careful people begin to share space without acknowledging that the sharing has become something more than logistics. She had the mornings, the flat was hers while I was at work. I had the evenings, food and conversation, and the particular quiet that exists when someone stops performing themselves and starts just being. The third near-confession moment happened on a Sunday. I was on the sofa reading. She was in the armchair across the room with her laptop, working through some online accountancy course she'd mentioned she'd been putting off for a year. The flat was grey afternoon quiet, the particular quality of light that happens in London in early April when the rain isn't quite falling and the sky can't decide. She said without looking up from the screen, "You eat dinner alone every night." "Not this week." "Before this week." "Yes," I said. "Before this week." "Doesn't that—" She stopped. "Doesn't it what?" She looked at me then. The laptop was still open on her knees. She had her glasses on, the ones she put on for screen work and took off when she was talking to me, which I'd noticed without meaning to. She didn't take them off. "Doesn't it feel like a waste," she said, "of someone like you?" The room did the thing rooms do when something arrives that wasn't planned. A slight shift in pressure, the sense of the walls moving half an inch inward. I looked at my book. "Someone like me?" I said. "Yes." "Define someone like me." She held my gaze with the patience of someone who has learned not to be outweighed. Someone who's very good at making space for people without making them feel like a problem to be managed. I said, "I've been told I'm managing." "You're not," she said. "That's what I mean." The room stayed changed. I went back to my book and she went back to her screen, and the gray light stayed where it was, and neither of us said anything else for 20 minutes, and it was the loudest 20 minutes of that entire week. Later, evening after dinner, doing dishes in the narrow kitchen with her drying and me washing, which had become our pattern without us deciding it, she said, "Tell me about Rose. How it ended. If you want to." "Long drift," I said. "Nothing dramatic." We both felt it coming and neither of us named it until it was too late for anything except courtesy. "She told me she was relieved when it ended," Nora said. "Which she felt terrible about." "That's fair," I said. I was a little relieved too. I also felt terrible about it. Why terrible? Because relief isn't a good sign about a relationship. It means something stopped working a long time before anyone admitted it. She dried a plate. Said, "Ray and I didn't end like that. Ours was the other kind. The dramatic kind. Sudden. Loud. He fell for someone else and he was not particularly graceful about it." She was very steady saying it. That steadiness that was not ease but practice. I had 26 years of a life I thought I understood, and then I had 3 years of trying to work out what to do with the ruins, and I think I've spent most of those 3 years standing in the rubble convinced that I should have seen it coming. Should you have? Probably some of it. She put down the plate. But that's a question that's only answering backward, isn't it? You can always see it coming looking back. Occupational habit, I said. She looked at me. Surveying, I said. Finding the damage after the fact and working out when it started. You get very good at the retrospective read. Doesn't help much in real time. She was quiet for a moment. Then, does it feel good though? The knowing. Not especially, I said. She smiled. It was the first full one, not the corner of the mouth thing, not the almost laugh. A real one. And it arrived and left quickly, the way her feelings moved. Present, then contained, then subsumed again under the surface composure. I turned back to the sink. My hands were in water. The window above the sink was dark and showed a reflection of the kitchen, both of us side by side, slightly doubled by the glass. I said, to the reflection or to her or to neither specifically, "You're going to be all right, you know?" She didn't answer right away. Then, "I know. I'm starting to believe it again." That landed. The thing that cracked it open wasn't a planned conversation. It was 11 days into her staying, a Wednesday mid-evening. I'd come home from a site visit, one of those days where everything in a building was worse than the previous inspection had suggested, which happens and is professionally demoralizing, and I was tired in the particular way that has nothing to do with sleep and everything to do with discovering rot behind walls that looked solid. She was cooking. She'd started doing this toward the end of the first week, taking over one dinner per day quietly without announcement. Not as payment. She'd made that clear. She put money toward groceries once and I'd redirected it into a household pot without discussion, and she'd accepted that with the grace of someone who understood the distinction between receiving help and accepting a loan. She cooked because she wanted to, she said. Because it was something she was good at and the kitchen was a workable size and she had the hours. She was making something with lemon that smelled the way her kitchen had smelled on the one evening I'd been there years ago. The lemon cake. That night I'd driven 6 hours after a bad survey week and Rose had been out and Nora had sat me down without a word and produced a slice of cake and tea, and I'd cried a little and she'd left the room like she hadn't seen it. That smell hit me in the doorway. She was at the hob with her back to me and she was doing the finger-counting thing with her left hand while she stirred something with her right, which meant she was thinking about something difficult. She hadn't heard me come in. I stood in the doorway for a moment longer than I needed to. Then I said, "That smells like your kitchen." She turned around. Read my face in one quiet sweep, the tired, the worn through the day I'd had, and turned back to the hob without comment. "Sit down," she said. I sat. She served dinner. We ate. She asked me about the site and I told her the actual truth of it, not the professional version, not the summary, but the specific frustration of standing in a building that had been failing for years while people lived in it and trusted it, and she listened in the way she listened, which was completely without filling the silences. Afterward, I was doing the dishes. She was at the table. And she said, "Can I ask you something?" "Sure." Pause. "Then, the night you came to Rosa's, the long drive years ago, you were upset about something. Survey went badly. Different building, similar situation." "No." She said it gently. "That wasn't the whole of it." I kept my hands in the water. "No," I agreed. "It wasn't. You and Rose things weren't right between you. We were starting to drift. I think I knew by then and hadn't said it yet. You sat at my table," she said, "and you were so," she stopped. Started again. "You looked so tired. Not work tired. Just tired of something not fitting." I said nothing. "I wanted to say something useful," she said. "I couldn't think of anything. So I left. The tea was useful. Cal." I turned around. She was looking at me with an expression I hadn't seen before, or hadn't let myself see. Not the composure. Not the practiced steadiness. Something underneath all of it, which was just her, direct and undefended, saying something she'd thought about without deciding to say. "I've thought about that evening more times than is probably reasonable," she said. "For a long time I told myself it was because I felt responsible, you and Rose, the situation. But that wasn't it. The kitchen was very still. The hob was off. The lamp was the only light. I didn't know what to do with that," she said, "so I made tea and left the room. And I've been doing a version of that ever since." She pressed her thumb to her fingers once, slowly. "And I think I'm done doing that." I looked at her. She looked back. She didn't look away. I said, "Nora." She said, "I know. There are about 14 reasons why." "I know," she said again, and there was something almost wry in it, something that was her, specifically, exactly her, that pulled the tension in the room sideways and allowed it to become something more habitable. "I'm not asking you for anything. I'm just telling you a true thing. Because I'm 52 years old and I'm done not saying true things." The clock on the microwave read 8:47 p.m. My hands were still dripping on the floor and I hadn't noticed. And then, from somewhere in the building directly above us, with the specific bad timing that old buildings reserve for their most dramatic moments, a pipe gave a sound like a foghorn played by someone who had never heard fog or a horn, followed by a sustained gurgling that vibrated gently through the ceiling light. Nora looked up at it. I looked up at it. "That's been doing that since February," I said. "I've told the landlord 3 times. She looked back at me. And she laughed, a real one, sudden and unguarded, the kind that doesn't know it's coming until it's already out. It changed her face completely. I laughed too. The pipe finished its commentary and went quiet. "If that just hit you the way it hit me every time I tell it, let me know where you're watching from in the comments. People have been finding these stories from every corner of the world and I want to know your corner. Subscribe if you haven't. A new story lands every week. Now, let me finish this one. We didn't talk about it that night. Not because we were avoiding it, we weren't exactly. More because the thing that needed to be said had been said, and the rest of it needed time to settle into the right shape. Some things are like structural decisions. You don't make them the night you find the problem. You take the reading. You let it sit. You come back when the information has organized itself." She went to bed. I sat on the sofa for a while. The lamp she'd left on was warm on the walls. I picked up my book and put it down 3 times. I thought about 14 reasons. Most of them were real. The history between us, the specific geometry of who she was in relation to who I'd been, was genuinely complicated in a way that wasn't drama, just fact. I thought about Rose, who would have an entirely reasonable set of feelings about this. I thought about Nora's life, which was in the middle of a reconstruction project and didn't need additional architecture imposed on it. Then I thought about the lemon smell in the kitchen and the safety pin on her sleeve, and the way she counted on her fingers when she was thinking, and the evening she'd left tea at my elbow without saying a word, and how that had been one of the most specifically kind things anyone had done for me in years, and how I had filed it away without examining it and apparently carried it for 2.5 years without knowing. Not falling. Not the dramatic kind. Just, this had been true for longer than I'd allowed myself to look at it. I called Rose on Thursday. This was not a conversation I'd been looking forward to. But I called because Nora would not ask me to, and because doing the thing that's hard before it becomes harder is both good practice and good manners, and because Rose deserved to hear it from me directly rather than not at all. She picked up on the third ring. "I need to talk to you about your mum," I said. Pause. Then, "I know." Another pause. "She called me this morning," Rose said. "She told me herself. She said she'd rather I heard it from her." Of course she had. "And?" I said. I heard Rose exhale. "And Cal, it's genuinely strange. I need you to know that. It's strange and I need a bit of time with it." "That's fair. But..." She stopped. When she started again, her voice was careful in the way that means she was choosing accurately. "But she's been quietly not okay for 3 years and I haven't known how to help her, and she knocked on your door because she knew you wouldn't fuss. And you didn't fuss. And she's been better this week than she's been in months. So, I'm not giving you my blessing," she said. "That's not mine to give. I'm just saying, I'm not going to make this difficult." "Thank you," I said. "Don't thank me," she said. "Just, be careful with her. She's been through a lot of careful with people who weren't." I said I would be. She said, "I know you will. That's why I'm not worried." We said goodbye and hung up, and I sat for a moment with the phone in my hand. Outside, the April evening was doing something almost warm. I knocked on the door of my own spare room. She said, "Come in." She was sitting on the bed with the accountancy course open on her laptop, glasses on, the small room organized with her particular neatness, everything in its place, nothing left out that didn't need to be. She looked up. I leaned in the doorframe. Said, "I spoke to Rose." Something shifted in her expression. "She's all right," I said. "She needs time. But she's all right." Nora nodded. Said, "She called me this morning." "I know." She told me. A small quiet fell. Then she took her glasses off and set them on the nightstand and looked at me with that direct, undefended thing that had started on Wednesday in the kitchen and hadn't quite closed over again since. "I'm not in the right part of my life to be someone's project," she said. "I know," I said. "You're not. I need to sort the house. Find somewhere permanent. Finish the course. Get steady again." "Yes," I said. "I'm telling you this because I need you to know I'm not." She stopped. Pressed her thumb to her fingers. "I'm not fragile. I'm just in the middle of something." "I know that too," I said. She looked at me. "So," I said, "maybe we go slowly. You sort the house. Finish the course. Get steady. I'm here. Nothing has to be anything before it's ready to be." She was quiet for a moment. "That's a very surveyor way of approaching a relationship," she said. "Structural patience," I said. "One of the job's few transferable skills." She looked at me for a long beat. Something in her face settled, not resignation, the other thing. The thing that looks like arriving somewhere after a long drive. "Quiet." "Sure." She said, "All right." One word. Small. Solid as load-bearing stone. May 2 months later. She'd found a flat. A good one, a ground floor in a building I happened to know was structurally sound because I'd done the survey the previous autumn and filed a favorable report. She didn't know this. I did not tell her this because it would have sounded like I'd arranged the whole thing, which I hadn't. It was coincidence, or the particular variety of coincidence that happens in a city where one person knows a lot of buildings. I helped her move in on a Saturday. 2 carloads, 1 hired man with a van for the furniture. She directed the placement of every piece with the calm efficiency of someone who has learned that the only things worth being precise about are the things you have to live with. She put a small lemon tree in a pot on the kitchen windowsill. Said it probably wouldn't survive, she'd never had good luck with plants. It survived. I know because I was there to watch it. August. A pub, a Sunday. Rose and her new partner, a calm, soft-spoken architect named Dan who clearly adored her, which was the right thing, joined us for lunch. There was a 45-minute window of spectacular awkwardness that gradually became something more like ordinary. By dessert, Rose was telling a story that involved me and Nora and a famously terrible survey I'd done of a building in Whitechapel, which was apparently funnier in retrospect than it had been at the time, and we were all laughing. Not the performed kind. The kind that happens when people are actually comfortable. Nora's hand was on the table. Mine was next to it. At some point they were touching. Neither of us made a decision about that. November. Her flat, a Friday evening. She'd passed the accountancy certification, with distinction as it happened, which surprised no one except her. I'd brought wine. She'd made dinner. We were at her kitchen table when she said, mid-sentence about something entirely unrelated, "I keep waiting for the part where this stops making sense." "Does it?" I said. "Still makes sense." "Yes," she said. Annoyingly. Why annoying? Because I'd prepared very good arguments for why it shouldn't. I moved my glass slightly to the left. Old habit. How good were they? Excellent. She looked at me. Completely watertight. I'd convinced myself. She paused. And then you do something like remember how I take my tea or argue with the radiator in the hallway as if it can hear you, and I'd lose the thread. The radiator can hear me, I said. It just doesn't care. She smiled. Nora, I said. Yes. I'm not going anywhere. She held my gaze. That direct thing, the undefended thing, that had started in my kitchen in April and never quite closed. She said, I know. I've been counting on it. February the following year, her kitchen, a Sunday morning, the lemon tree on the windowsill doing improbably well. She was making coffee. I was reading the paper in the way people read papers when they are not really reading the paper. I had a small box in my jacket pocket that I'd been carrying for 3 weeks without finding the right moment, which was either extremely careful or extremely cowardly, depending on your read. She put a mug next to my elbow. Without looking up. Just placed it there. Same as she'd placed the tea that night 2.5 years ago, at her kitchen table in a different house that no longer belonged to her. Same quiet understanding of what someone needs and when to leave them to it. I looked at the mug. Looked at her. She was back at the counter, hands around her own coffee, looking out the window at the street. I said, You know what this is. She turned around. I had the box out of my pocket. Nothing elaborate. Just here. She looked at it. Looked at me. Said, The tea again? The tea again, I said. She stood there for a moment, that breath, that quiet square of the shoulders, and then she came over and sat down across from me and opened the box and looked at the ring for a long time without speaking. The lemon tree was in the window. The street outside was doing whatever streets do in February, gray, ordinary, indifferent. Then she said, Yes. Just that. Private. Sure. No audience. We tell it different ways depending on who's asking. A knock on the door, she says. Past 11, I say. I was doing something critical. He was arguing with his pasta. The pasta had it coming. That's always where people stop asking and start laughing, which is the right ending for any story about two people who found each other in the specific, undramatic, completely ordinary way that the right things sometimes arrive. Quiet, patient, and through the door you didn't know was open. If you made it to the end, thank you. Genuinely. Drop a comment and tell me where in the world you're watching from. I read every single one and every location surprises me. If this story found you at the right time, subscribe. A new one arrives every week. I'll see you in the next one.